I know how much we all love Jeranism. You know, Jeranism, one of the leading flat earth researchers, debaters, and debunkers here on YouTube. And I know how much we all love theoretical physics. But turns out that these two things don't like each other. For some reason. Beats me. Now, you heard me right. I know it's surprising, but the guy that spends a little bit too much time on YouTube proclaiming that the Earth isn't the shape that every scientist says it is, doesn't believe in the entire branch of physics that is theoretical physics. He doesn't think that physics works the way they think it does. So, how do we know who's right? Well, the real scientists are, but Jeranism has something to say about it.
First, what is theoretical physics? Well, theoretical physics uses math and theory in order to come up with or derive the fundamental laws of nature and to make conclusions from these laws. Yep, ideas in mathematics giving little to no weight to experiments or observations. Sounds fun, huh?
Well, that's a little unfair, don't you think? It's true that theoretical physics isn't entirely based on experiment or observation and relies heavily on mathematics, but that doesn't mean that it gives no credit to them, no weight to them. Experiments and observations are still incredibly important even in theoretical physics. Now, given our current technology and budgets, it's practically impossible to test a lot of the theoretical theories that we have today. But when we are able to do so, sometimes it turns out to be correct. Such was the case with Einstein's theory of relativity. And where do they get these numbers with all this math that they're doing? Where do these numbers come from? I'll tell you where they come from. They come from measurements, i.e. observations made in the real world. I don't know how Jeranism thinks this is working. I think he just has this idea of people just throwing around numbers, whether or not it makes any sense, and acting like they have it all figured out to get government money or something. I don't know. But these equations are indeed based on the real world. Maybe understanding theoretical physics just takes a little bit of abstract thought that flat earthers in general kind of lack.
Books have been written and questions have been asked because to some it has become obvious that physics has been stuck for years, that a focus on mathematical elegance rather than reality has led the so-called science astray.
So this is pretty much what I was saying before. Jeranism sees that these guys are using math to come up with a wealth of knowledge and not doing it the way he wants them to. So he's all like, not my physics.
It reminds me of a quote from Nikola Tesla, who of course was a real scientist, not a theoretical physicist, who said,
I'm going to stop you right there. Nikola Tesla was not a scientist. He was an engineer and an inventor, and he was very good at being an engineer and an inventor, but a scientist he was not. I mean, in his spare time he was a charlatan, so I can see the confusion, but it doesn't look like he's ever published any sort of scientific article. And he didn't even believe in subatomic particles. He didn't believe in the electron, specifically. Not a scientist. Not a scientist. I mean, he made really big claims that he had figured all of this out, especially when Einstein came around and proposed his theory of relativity. Because this was a pretty big change from the common belief at the time, and Tesla was not the only one to oppose the idea of relativity. Yet he never published any sort of evidence he had of the entirety of theoretical physics being wrong. And even after he died, people went through his works, his records, papers, whatever it is that he left behind. I don't really know. But they found nothing that supported all of his magical claims. But this is the perfect role model for the flat earther who longs to be as good of a charlatan as Tesla was.
The scientists from Franklin to Morse were clear thinkers and did not produce erroneous theories. The scientists of today think deeply instead of clearly. One must be sane to think clearly, but one can think deeply and be quite insane. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. Nikola Tesla.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what this quote was addressing, because of course Jeranism isn't going to give us any sort of context, but Nikola Tesla said similar things about Einstein's theory of relativity, as I've mentioned earlier, and through experiments, Einstein's theory of relativity was later found to be pretty correct. It turns out Einstein was a genius. Why I don't understand this infatuation with Tesla. Smart guy with what he did, but he acted a lot smarter than what he was.
Let's list some of these theoretical physicists because maybe you've heard of some of them.
Okay, so we listed off a lot of theoretical physicists. I don't know if I'm going to show everyone that he mentioned because it's a bit long, a bit boring, and I'm not sure that all of them are entirely relevant, but there are some interesting things in there, such as
Christian Huygens, who in 1653 came up with the distance from Earth to the Sun when he guessed, yes, guessed, they say correctly by chance, the size of Venus, allowing him to measure the Earth to the Sun distance.
It turns out that he was entirely correct when we measure the distance using other means. So that should be a testament to how useful and accurate theoretical physics can be. He mentioned
Henry Cavendish, who used balls in his shed to correctly come up with the mass and weight of the Earth.
First off, this was an experiment. This is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to argue against. This is experimental physics. And this is theoretical physics being tested and measured with experiments. And Cavendish's experiments, they were a success. His conclusions were correct. Now, flat earthers have a thing against the Cavendish experiment, probably because it actually works and shows that the Earth has mass, which they don't like. This is another example of flat earthers throwing away evidence for little or no reason, and instead substituting their own, a sort of alternative facts, if you will.
Or Albert Einstein in relativity and the bending of space-time.
And through numerous experiments, turns out he was right, so he has no reason to be upset about all this math mumbo-jumbo. And lastly, he mentions
Michio Kaku, who tells us all about string theory.
Which, I don't know if he's doing this on purpose, or if he just can't read, but it's not Michio Kaku, it's Michio Kaku. It's a Japanese name.
But I want to come back to one in particular to help us answer our question, and that is Michio Kaku.
Michio Kaku?
In a recent interview, Michio Kaku said the following. Now listen carefully, as I believe he gives us the answer pretty much straight up.
You're not going to believe this. In science, we always say that you make observations, you have a theory, you go make more observations, and it's a very, very tedious process. Wrong. Nobody that I know of in my field uses the so-called scientific method. In our field, it's by the seat of your pants. It's leaps of logic. It's guesswork.
In that quote, I believe we find our answer. He said, plain as day, that nobody that he knows of in his field, and his field is theoretical physics, uses the so-called scientific method.
Okay, so there are several things wrong with this, of course, apart from it just being a cherry-picked, out-of-context quote. But he mentioned that this was a recent interview. It indeed is not. This interview came from C-SPAN in 2010, October 2010. So that's, 9 years ago now? And this video of Jeranism that we are watching together was released in 2019, December 2019. And the biggest thing to note is that his field isn't the entirety of theoretical physics, as Jeranism says it is. His field is string theory, specifically string field theory. Now, this quote was actually an answer to a question that was asked by the interviewer, and that question was, where did string theory come from, and who was the founder of it? So, no, his field isn't theoretical physics. He isn't a master of all of theoretical physics, and the entirety of theoretical physics is not what he was talking about here. So even if Michio Kaku turns out to be wrong, and the entirety of string theory is just thrown out the window, that doesn't mean that Einstein's relativity is wrong. It doesn't mean that quantum theory is wrong. And I think the last really big point is that, well, this is an interview with C-SPAN. This isn't exactly a scientific journal article. Now, I mean, I don't expect this to be, but if Jeranism was going to present any sort of proof, any sort of evidence that the entirety of theoretical physics needs to be thrown out, it's funny how he can't get it from an official, legitimately scientific source. It has to be a news interview where Michio Kaku is pressured to give accurate answers quickly. Because this was live TV. He wasn't saying that, oh, we don't follow the scientific method at all, and we just kind of do everything willy-nilly, make up anything we want. His point is that it isn't this tedious process that the layman may think it is. They don't primarily rely on experiment and observation, but primarily relies on mathematical model and such things. It is still indeed science, and no one branch of science follows the scientific method the way it was taught to you in school to the T. It's adapted, or I guess you could say changed. Some parts are emphasized, some things are de-emphasized, some branches of science are only dealing with one stage of the scientific method, and that's kind of what's happening here.
And when you don't use the scientific method, what you practice is no longer called science. It's simply called pseudoscience.
Okay, first off, they are following the scientific method. They are just focusing on the hypothesizing, the theorizing, the predictions, and experimental physics will take on the rest. Nobody follows the exact scientific method as you were taught, exactly the way you were taught it. Instead, certain branches make far more sense operating in different ways. But creating multiple ad hoc hypotheses isn't the scientific method either. Though flat earthers do tend to try to present themselves in a way that seems scientific, but that just makes it all the more pseudoscientific.
This chart shows the characteristics of pseudoscience versus actual science. Pseudoscience avoids falsifiability. It has vagueness in measurement. It takes what is unproven as false equals true. It has confirmation bias. It spends money and resources without care and has a reversed burden of proof. Sounds a lot like the Big Bang, universe expansion, dark matter, relativity, space-time, black hole science, unification theory.
A lot of that has been thoroughly proven, so this is just ramblings of a madman. But that actually sounds a lot more like the idea that the sun is really small, really close to us, and only giving off a spotlight sort of effect. That's the idea that flat earthers have. And I guess they don't spend tons of money trying to propose that idea and trying to prove that to everyone, including themselves. But, I mean, vagueness and measurement in particular. When have flat earthers been incredibly precise with their measurements? You will not... Well, you'd be hard-pressed to find a flat earther saying the sun is exactly this far away, this high in the sky, because somebody can then come along and say, well, according to the angle that it should be here where I live in this place, that is incorrect. Flat earthers can't even give you measurements of the continent of Australia because their map distorts it so much. They can't give you measurements of plane flights, just really anything, whether or not they assert that their complete model is true, because they never do. They never say, oh, we figured it out 100%, because then it'd be open to criticism, wouldn't it? Ask a flat earther for a measurement of anything.
Is theoretical physics pseudoscience? I think the answer is clearly yes. Or you can continue to believe these guys and take the things they say as fact, like when we asked Michio Kaku to explain string theory.
These guys think that there's a dome above our atmosphere called the firmament. A lot of them do, not all of them do. And talking about how we all believe these hundreds of scientists who came up with all of these things, which were later found out to be true, but yet he's clinging on to the ideas held by Nikola Tesla, the electrical engineer who didn't believe in the electron.
Or when someone asks Lawrence Krauss how the universe was created from nothing, and he gives this answer.
Let me just give a 1-minute answer because it's a long. What is remarkable, and to create, and the conservation of energy, you would think, and this is one of the arguments often used, conservation of energy means you can't start with nothing and have a universe with something. But what is amazing is when you add gravity into the mix, a miracle occurs, that a natural miracle. That gravity allows negative energy as well as positive energy configurations. And you can create, for example, 2 particles out of nothing. Now they have energy because of their rest mass. But if the gravitational field they're in is strong enough, the gravitational potential energy attracting them together is so strong and negative that the sum total of those 2 bits of energy can be precisely 0. And you can create those particles with impunity. And in fact, that happens, we think, near black holes. And in fact, it will happen in empty space. And so in fact, to create stuff, you don't need stuff. You just need nothing. And in this case, quantum mechanics.
Well, then you'll know that the reason these answers don't make any sense at all is because they are nothing more than pseudoscientific junk. Period.
In your opinion, dear Jaron, in your opinion. Now, by Krauss's own admission, he did not have enough time to properly and thoroughly explain his ideas. So it seems like Jaronism here is cherry-picking interviews where the interviewee is not given quite enough time to explain the very deep and intricate ideas that they are trying to explain. These are the way that they would explain them to the layman, because these are science popularizers. But because that makes no sense to Jaron the Flat Earther, it's all bunk. Einstein was bunk. Gravity doesn't exist. Neither does black holes or anything that Jaron can't see with his 2 eyes.
Of course, you're free to your own opinion. Maybe you have a different answer, but when somebody asks me, is theoretical physics actually pseudoscience? The easy answer is yes.
Yet, flat earthers in general tend to believe that buoyancy and density accounts for things falling, despite the fact that that requires gravity to exist in the first place. They're trying to explain away gravity with something that is caused by gravity. But they have it all figured out. These guys know what's pseudoscience and what's not. I've seen the YouTube channels that these guys are subscribed to. Not Jaronism specifically, I don't think, but plenty of other YouTube flat earthers. And suffice it to say, they are crazy. All right, well, my camera's about to die. So moral of the story, when a flat earther tries to tell you what is science and what is not, keep in mind that they think that Nikola Tesla is the greatest scientist ever, despite him not being a scientist in the first place. Goodbye. See you in the next video. Subscribe, like, I don't know. I hope you enjoyed.
Well, then you'll know that the reason these answers don't make any sense at all is because they are nothing more than pseudoscientific junk. Period.